everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Quality Intelligence from Information to Knowledge. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature and we will have a live Q&A with Peter at the end. After we're done, I'll send out a copy of the slides as well as a presentation recording. Before we begin, I would like to introduce ourselves. My name is Taylor Minks, and I'm the marketing lead at Redica Systems. Redica Systems is a data analytics platform helping life science companies improve their quality and stay on top of evolving regulations. Our proprietary process transforms one of the industry's most complete data sets, aggregated from dozens of health agencies and Freedom of Information Act, FOIA sourcing, into meaningful answers and insights that reduce regulatory risk and compliance risk. Founded in 2010, Redica Systems serves over 200 customers in the pharma, medical device, and food industries, including 19 of the top 20 pharma companies and 9 of the top 10 medical device companies. Today's presenter, Peter Baker, President of Live Oak Quality Assurance, has been consulting nationally and internationally since April 2019. Prior to consulting, Peter spent 11 years as a U.S. FDA drug investigator, with 7 of those years spent working in FDA's overseas offices located in India, China, and Chile. Peter was named FDA Investigator of the Year in 2013 for his work uncovering serious breaches in data integrity and has a special interest in data governance and compliance with 21 CFR Part 11. Live Oak Quality Assurance focuses on training and employee empowerment and critical thinking with the goal of improving the quality of medicines through good data management and quality intelligence. Just as a reminder for everyone, we will have the QA section at the end, so please enter any questions or comments you have throughout the presentation. And now I'll pass it on to Peter to begin today's webinar.
Thanks, Taylor. And thanks to Redica for letting me do this webinar with y'all today. It's an interesting topic because you don't see. It's my first time actually presenting this topic of quality intelligence, and you'll notice that the title has actually changed a little bit from what you maybe saw on LinkedIn or on the website itself. Before it was from information to knowledge, and as I was putting together the presentation, I realized that actually that's just a part of the journey that we're on. Today we're going to be talking about a roadmap to success or roadmap to compliance in the 21st century. And my original title didn't really encompass the full roadmap that I wanted to cover today. So I expanded the title that you see here on the slide from data. So that's that first step, collection of data, all the way to the end of what we're trying to do with this roadmap, which is transforming that data into intelligence. Now, there are many steps along the way that get you there, right? And we're going to be covering all of those in brief today, but just keep in mind that this is a much larger topic. Like this journey encompasses a lot of different aspects. For example, like data governance, one of those steps along the road from data to intelligence. That in and of itself is a massive topic. So today, we're just talking mostly about the roadmap, and we'll take some 43s from recent FDA inspections to sort of examine where are the regulators going in this area. What are the current expectations in 2023 about how far along this journey should we be at the moment? All right. Again, like I mentioned, I'm excited about this topic. It's my first time, so I apologize for any interruptions or confusion in my presentation on these topics. This is my first time doing this. And to look at some of the survey results that y'all participated in order to gain entry to this webinar, we see some interesting results. I think for the maturity question on CPV, I think that's pretty much in line with what I expected. Like intermediate, maybe some oversight when we talk about continuous process verification. The majority of folks said we're in the intermediate stage. And I think that's in line with what I see examining recent 43s, but also working as a consultant with several different companies. I think that's pretty much in line with my expectations. And the same with using dashboards, maybe like not sure, right? That was the majority. We had some beginners, intermediates, and only a few for advanced, and that certainly is in line with what I expected. I think the one that sort of surprised me a little bit is the knowledge management program. Like, how mature are we on knowledge management? We saw the vast majority of folks saying that it was adequate, meaning it was presented if requested. And that was a little bit I think that's actually quite exciting in a way to see that companies are confident in their knowledge management program. I didn't expect that. So yeah, let's see how it goes. Maybe after we talk about some of the recent 43s, maybe some companies might change their response on that one. But hopefully not. I mean, hopefully this does in fact represent the current state of the folks that join in the call today. So we're talking about the goal of quality intelligence, right? Is world-class manufacturing. And this is a blog I wrote a couple of weeks ago, actually, on this thought of like, everybody's aiming for this world-class manufacturing, right? And we can see that quality intelligence is one of probably several different components that are going to get us there. But what is this barrier towards where we are at the moment, where we feel like sometimes we're on this continuous treadmill or like a hamster wheel of deviations and CAPAs. And when we look at some of those CAPAs, maybe they're more like patchwork, right? They'll address maybe like that specific issue, but probably when we sign off on that CAPA, deep down, we might think that this is probably not going to really get to fixing the actual root cause, which might be something more systematic in the way we manage our quality system. So a lot of us find ourselves on that hamster wheel, right? So how do we break through and get to this world-class manufacturing process that we're looking for? Well, what we have to do is break down this barrier, and the barrier is lack of knowledge, right? And so that's sort of one of the main themes that we'll be discussing today. So how can we actually break down that barrier? How can we transform, we could say, data, whether that's paper, electronic, however we collect that data and metadata, put it in context, generate information, eventually systematically organize that data. Now it's called knowledge, and then figure out how to use that knowledge to get off of this continuous treadmill. That's intelligence. And so yeah, this was like a simple schematic, for example, of the current state of where oftentimes many of us find ourselves, with the outcomes being quite substantial, right? Not only for ourselves, like for example 43s, but also for the patient, right? When we talk about drug shortages and poor quality medicines as a result of this barrier that exists between where we are on our treadmill and where we're trying to go. So maybe today we'll talk about some tools to sort of get ourselves off of this treadmill and start actually moving forward. And so here we're going to start with the simple roadmap. Oh, simple, but actually, quite intense. There's no way this is going to be an overnight transformation. Like, oh, hey, like in a month, let's make sure we have this quality intelligence program implemented at all our sites around our global network. Not really, right? This is a years-long program. Many of us already started, like for example, the initial MHRA guidance document on data integrity all the way back in 2015. That's 8 years ago, right? That's an excellent start. Because what that is, what that guidance document and other regulatory guidance documents are really focusing on are those Alcoa Plus principles. That's a necessary component on our road trip. As we're trying to get to intelligence, we can't skip any of these steps along the way. But luckily, it's not like we're starting from scratch, right? We already have Alcoa Plus principles ingrained in our quality systems through training, through the way we write documents, through the way we set up software control programs. Everything is sort of focused around those initial core principles of Alcoa Plus. So that's a great start. And that was step one. Many of us are past step one, right? So that's that data integrity. Now we're talking about step two, which is governance. And here we see the first mention of this in regulatory guidance in 2019. When when the PICS organization outlined their guidance document for data integrity. That became finalized in 2019. So again, that's the PICS guidance for data integrity. And threaded throughout that guidance document, you see this focus on governance. So this is taking, those Alcoa Plus principles and saying, all right, yeah, we know we're not going to be perfect in the way we, record data as far as like contemporaneous. I might have to do an action and then write it on paper 2 or 3 minutes later. Is that okay? Because theoretically, like literally, speaking, that is not compliant with Alcoa Plus. But what governance does, which is step 2 in our journey, is allows us to acknowledge the fact that we're never going to be perfect with those data integrity expectations outlined in the original guidance. What we are going to do, however, is take a risk-based approach. So that was step 2. And, a lot of companies are in the midst of step 2 at the moment. We see companies trying to figure out how to do risk-based review of audit trails, or risk-based review of alarms out in manufacturing, or risk-based review of integration parameters or audit trails within chromatography data systems. This is step 2, and we're right in the many companies are right in the middle of that. And now we move to step 3, which is, as a result of this data governance, and one of the biggest outcomes of this and why it's such a cool idea is one of the biggest benefits out of that, other than patient safety, is this ownership, right? That governance talks about. It's like, we've always known, like, say I'm an operator, I've always known like what I do. It's written in the SOP, right? But what was missing in the past years was why I do it. And so when unusual pressures come my way, or when something doesn't go the way I expect it to go, sometimes I might end up taking shortcuts because I know what I do, but I really don't know why I do it. So for me to take this shortcut, it's really no big deal, right? Well, what governance does is it makes that connection to operators, analysts, and QA folks, everybody that is functioning within the pharmaceutical quality system outlined in Q10. What it does is it makes this connection, not only what you do, yeah, it's in the SOP, but why you do it. And once that connection is done, we can realize what the regulators have been talking about for years, or industry organizations as well have been talking about for years, which is this idea of quality culture. You can say like, yeah, sure, let's have a quality culture in place. But we can say like, okay, but by what means? If you don't have the tools to achieve what you're talking about with quality culture, you're never going to get there. Otherwise, you would have experienced that quality culture that you were looking for last year. No, there has to be new tools in place to actually get to where you're going. And that is where governance steps in step 2. And then once we have these in place, now we can realize the full potential of ICH Q10. If you read that document again, what you're going to see is it goes far beyond what we see in like they call it core GMP requirements. We're talking about predictive quality systems, reacting to issues before they become OOSs or recalls or adverse events. This is this high level functioning ICH Q10 pharmaceutical quality system. And then next, after that, once we've realized that quality culture, now we can start talking about knowledge management. So we have our organization focused around value in data, value in metadata. Now we can start to figure out, all right, now that we've established how important this is to us and to our patients, now we can figure out a systematic way of organizing data and metadata that we already collect in our pharmaceutical quality system to use that data in different ways that we haven't been using that data and metadata in the past. This is knowledge management. It's the framework, right? It's the framework. And so, you'll hear companies talking about new software solutions, about how they're going to organize data. You'll see companies talking about middleware or a data lake, right? These are the types of solutions to implement what ICH Q10 talks about with regard to knowledge management. And we're actually going to see that excerpt from ICH Q10 here in a couple of slides. What do they mean exactly by knowledge management? It's a systematic way of organizing data that you are already required to collect, review, and maintain. Yeah. And if you were if you were on the BioForum webinar on Tuesday, there was an excellent presentation given by Yash, who's the CEO over at QBD Vision, about fair data principles. Excellent concepts when you're thinking about how you're going to roll out these new solutions for knowledge management. One of the core like principles about how all the like a checklist almost that you have to go through are included in that FAIR principles. So make sure as you step into this step 4, as you begin step 4, so to speak, make sure FAIR principles are at the top of your checklist, your critical thinking checklist, to make sure you're online with regulatory expectations in this step. Now we're optimizing that framework and we're getting ready to go. And then step 5 on our journey is visualization. Now, once we've systematically organized our data and metadata using whatever software solution we prefer, now we can start to see the data in different ways. And many companies are starting to build data dashboards for all different types of parameters, attributes, whatever they want to visualize within their pharmaceutical quality system. That dashboarding is really an excellent way to do that. Cognitive researchers, publish research about like, okay, how much of our brain power is dedicated to different areas of life, right? So you've heard about the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain with different functions. So with regard to like processing information, what they found is about 75% of our cognitive capability is dedicated to the processing of visual images. And only 25% is dedicated to non-visual images like verbal or audio or something like that, right? So in order to really use our full capability to process this knowledge that we're gaining by organizing our data, one excellent way to do that is through dashboarding. So again, this is one of the stops along the road to intelligence can be dashboarding. And with that, I think under this same subpoint, we also see vigilant operations management oversight. And that is a term I cut and pasted directly from recent FDA warning letters, starting in about 2019, which is, I think, not coincidentally, the same time FDA published their white paper on drug shortage potential solutions. We see a shift in the way FDA warning letters are written, really with this focus on oversight, like process oversight. At first, they wrote it this vigilant monitoring of inter and intra-batch variability. They have hence like changed that to vigilant operations management oversight. But I think those two concepts are really the same. Like, how are you vigilantly monitoring your process in order to determine the current state of your quality system? So focusing on data. So that allows us to make a more objective evaluation about the state of our quality system, as opposed to the past, where we were talking about quality metrics. I think those still have some value, right? But they're quite subjective if we take a step back and look at them, right? They don't often give much of a like actionable or valuable insight into like the state of our pharmaceutical quality system by those older like quality metrics that we used to use. So we see this change about, okay, now we want to focus more on process variability, eliminating variability or reducing variability from our processes. This framework that we've already started, we're already on this journey, most likely somewhere in step 2, hopefully step 3, right? This process is going to allow us to get to where the regulators have been pushing us for about 4 years now in those warning letters. And then finally, last but definitely not least, we see the quality intelligence stop, which is the final stop in our journey, right? We fill up at gas 4 or 5 times along the road, and we're finally there, which is quality intelligence. And this is a really cool, we see FDA's concept paper on artificial intelligence just being released, I believe, last month, right? So it's not even really a white paper, or certainly not a guidance yet, but we see some thoughts or about where the regulators might be heading with regard to artificial intelligence. And one other subpoint that I have to mention here, and I think it's a new concept for me. I've been researching it like just for this webinar, actually, this idea or this theory of a relationality. It's a very cool concept, and it goes along with the goals of AI as well. Like, for example, neural networking, if you happen to be into AI yourself, right? And so what this theory says is like, all things are connected to other things. I mean, that's a really simplistic way of saying it, but like, so for example, in our world, say you have a pH value that's in process control, maybe step 4 or 5 along an 8-step process, right? So that represents data, right? But eventually we want to get to the point where we can understand how that pH value affects downstream operations as well. Yeah, it's within specifications for sure, But could that pH value regarding like how high or low it is within our specification limits, could that predict how future steps along the process are going to perform? That is the relationality. And this is really the goal of intelligence, really like advancing our understanding of our process. So not only downstream effects, but also upstream, right? So if we see a value within our specification limit, low or high, well, what upstream influences were actually affecting that? So we could eliminate or reduce that variability on those upstream steps in order to improve the efficiency at step 4, which is where we are at the moment. Really cool concept of relationality. And I see this as our primary focus, where we're going with regard to intelligence at the moment. I mean, that could change. And these are just my initial thoughts on this. Remember, this is the first time I'm really sort of addressing this. This is sort of like where I see this going. The cool thing here is you can't, I don't know if this is cool or not. I said it's cool. I should say the important thing about this roadmap is really, and this is not exhaustive. So there may be additional steps that I'm missing, or some of these steps maybe not represent a whole step. Like you could probably combine data governance and quality culture into one stop, right? But this is just the 6 stops that I could think of when I was putting this presentation together. The important part about this roadmap, however, is that you can't skip a step. There's no way you can build dashboarding without first having a knowledge management program in place. And we're going to see that in some of the 43s that we're going to be looking at today, right? So you're making decisions, like, for example, we'll see one where a risk-based decision is made about complaints. But really, that was based on what the investigator found is like that was a subjective conclusion, right? Because you weren't evaluating your entire available data set in order to make that risk conclusion. Whoa, interesting. If you don't follow the roadmap, you take shortcuts, you're most likely going to get in trouble. And I sort of have this analogy here, right? Which is the what is it called? But something familia. Anyways, I was in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago, and I was first there in 2002, and then I visited 20 years later, and this cathedral is still under construction. Many of you are familiar with this because it's a long process. They really want it to reflect the values of the original architect, and they're taking their time doing it, right? And when you walk inside this cathedral, it really is almost like a life-changing experience. You can see there's a lot of thought, planning, and effort that went into making this right. They focus on quality. Yeah, it's taken 20 years, but the end result is going to be excellent. Now, I'm not saying we're going to take 20 years to get to quality intelligence, but it's going to take time. Don't skip any of the steps along the way, because that can lead to unintended risk to patient safety. And that's something we've got to avoid as we move into the future. So there are some essentials on this road trip from a regulatory standpoint, so to speak. And so, like, for example, we talk about data integrity. Well, this is really about empowerment of employees, right? That has to be part of your experience with data integrity. It can't be like forcing the data integrity Alcoa expectations onto frontline employees. That's not gonna work, right? It has to be about empowerment. And with data governance, you can't do data governance without new tools, right? So when we talk about quality risk management, what are the tools that you're using to get to a point where you have true risk-based review of audit trails, true risk-based review of alarms or BMS data, things like that? And how are you going to get to the point where employees understand why they do what they do? Well, that comes with first empowerment, and then second, appropriate tools. So I just list a couple of them here on this slide, like data and process mapping has to be there. Qualitative risk assessments have to be part of your toolbox. You can't have a single risk management tool like FMEA in your quality system. You're going to get tripped up, and you're never going to advance past step 2. Forget about true dashboarding visualization. Certainly not a Q10 that you're going to be like ready to present for inspection readiness. You're not going to get there. And then quality culture and mindset. Well, now here when we look at Q10, we see like this management-led organization. So the way we do management review in pharmaceuticals has to be updated. And it can get there, right? If we finish step 1 and step 2, especially step 2, because you're going to have a lot of now new ways of evaluating information. Well, what's going to make it into management review? We can't get lost in the weeds. We can't have 100 issues coming to management every month during management review. We just need the one that matters, or the 2 that actually matter. How are you going to set up your risk-based review framework to ensure that management review can really be aligned with current regulatory expectations? Well, it comes through the tools and empowerment. You see how all these steps just build on the previous step to get there. And now we have knowledge management. So this is going to be that systematic arrangement of all of our data, right? With the future thought of using that data to make decisions, standalone CAPAs, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what we have to do is embrace a new way of doing validation. We see the CSA guidance published by FDA a couple of months ago, right? And that's talking about a more agile approach towards software validation. And it certainly has to be something we can embrace, should embrace as we start to do this, because with the idea that it's never going to be perfect, it just has to be good enough to meet its intended use. Because really what we're trying to do here in the later steps is enhance the ability of a human to do their existing job. Like, for example, we're talking about standalone CAPAs. That's a quality system corrective action requirement. Well, we already do those. All we're trying to do is enhance our ability to make those CAPAs, standalone CAPAs, even better than they are today. So that's the intended use. So we certainly want to get there, right? We don't want validation to get in the way of what we're trying to do. Don't let perfection get in the way of really good. And so that's this agile concepts that we see in CSA that we're going to have to embrace as we talk about these new technologies or new ways of managing data. How do we get data from a paper record, like a logbook, into a database? There's no way that's going to be perfect. It just has to be good enough for its intended use, which is, again, to enhance the ability of a human to make a decision to improve patient safety. We shouldn't let compliance, like this thought of perfect compliance with Part 11, for example, get in the way of these meaningful improvements to the pharmaceutical quality system. For more information on that, for sure, check out ICHQ9. It's perfectly outlined in that document of how to embrace these concepts that we see in the CSA. And when we talk about visualization, what we're really addressing here is this critical thinking. It allows us to think critically about how our data affects our patients. And finally, quality intelligence. This is that maturity step that we're all really aiming for. FDA has an entire white paper dedicated to quality management maturity, right? This is one of the aspects that are going to allow you to demonstrate maturity to the regulators and take advantage of what they're offering within that white paper. It's a long drive, folks. Don't forget the essentials. Don't forget the water. Don't forget your snacks. It's a long road trip. And we just, with the idea of that, we can't skip any of the steps along the way, right? There are really like no shortcuts allowed. That's gonna cause us to trip up and probably, in fact, have to go backwards from like a warning letter response or something like that. We don't want to get caught in that situation. But if we follow the roadmap, which is already out there, in regulatory guidance, we are perfectly in line with where we're going. And those of you who have rented a car in Maui over in Hawaii know that there's this point in the road that you are not allowed to drive on with your rental car. If you do and you get caught, you're gonna have to pay quite a bit of money, right? And so the same idea here with this quality intelligence roadmap. Don't take the shortcut. So if you're staying in Honolulu Bay, you got to do the long drive around, right? Don't take the shortcut, because if there's a high likelihood that GPS tracker, they're going to see it. When you return that rental car, you're going to get a hefty fine. So it's an interesting analogy about what we're talking about today. And all knowledge management is, we see this in ICHQ 10, right? The link down here in the bottom. It's this, what they're talking about with knowledge management. It's just a systematic approach towards acquiring, analyzing, storing, and disseminating information out there and using it to improve patient safety outcomes. That's the whole goal of knowledge management. Nothing more, nothing less. And we can get there for sure as step 4, certainly after governance is set up. And this is like the halfway point, right? We're getting halfway to our destination of true intelligence. That's why I expanded the title of today's presentation. But if you're taking shortcuts, you're going to pay the price. And we see some of these warning letters that are very recent. Like I believe this one is just from like February of 2023. This company was using an EBR, or like an electronic batch record, but it wasn't configured to ensure contemporaneous recording of data because, yeah, it's an EBR, a fantastic electronic solution to how we do batch records today. But it has to be done right. It has to be appropriate for its intended performance, right? Part 1110A, consistent intended performance. So personnel within this EBR can make changes to data entries without triggering an event in the audit trail until they manually click the save button. So if we talk about an analogy with paper, that would be like using pencil on an old school paper batch record and then being able to erase it and then finally transcribe it with pen. There's no way that would be allowed in a modern, not even an old school quality system would allow that. But so how is it okay in 2023 to do essentially the same thing with an electronic solution? The company tried to take a shortcut, right? They tried to do data governance without first understanding Alcoa Plus, right? That's a shortcut. The GPS tracker picked it up, they returned the rental car, and they got a big fine, right? We don't want to do that. We want to go slowly. We want to pack right. We want to have all our supplies in place, and then we're going to take off on our road trip. And there's other communications out there as well, like within the database. If we just type in like knowledge management in the Redica search, we see a whole bunch of guidance already available for knowledge management. I picked the one here that from the ICMRA, which is this international coalition for like harmonization. And what we see in there is the reflection paper on knowledge management. I encourage you to sort of explore the different guidances that are out there on knowledge management, all pointing towards the ability to take data, whether it's paper on glass, like that would be electronic, whatever you happen to call it, and transform it into something useful, right? So you can actually use it to get to that next step of maturity. The other parts of the roadmap that are going to get us there from a regulatory perspective involve some of the Q documents within the ICH framework. We talk about continuous improvement. These are the different guidances that are available that are going to allow us to really achieve this knowledge management and eventual intelligence, like help us on this road trip that we're on. Q8, the R&D, the development, that's really like you get the massive benefits if you take your time in Q8, use the QBD principles to set up success for the Q10 stage. Just real excellent pointers in that guidance. Q9, this process understanding, data governance, a risk-based approach. Q10, we see CPV outlined in there, as well as management review. Now we're talking about quality intelligence. And for those of you with innovator products, Q12, wow, excellent, like just this bonus. If you follow Q8, Q9, and Q10, you get some excellent bonuses outlined in Q12, like post-approval flexibility and other things like that. This has been around for decades, this concept of continuous improvement, but we didn't always think about like a realistic roadmap to get there. It's out there, but we've just got to put these pieces of the puzzle together into an achievable goal. And that's sort of kind of what we're trying to do today. We see this into the future. Well, where is sort of the regulators going? Well, enhancing the availability of high quality medicines. We see that in the drug shortage white paper, like the 21st century vision for compliance. This is really a driving factor in a lot of ways warning letters are written, the way guidance are written these days, enhancing the availability of high quality medicines. So it's not just talking about adding layer upon layer of compliance expectations. No, it's about doing things according to a risk-based approach, to keep costs low, yet quality high. You'll see in all these guidance documents that perfect balance between, another layer of compliance. No, it's just taking our existing quality system and working smarter rather than harder, using data that we're already required to keep, review, maintain, whatever, collect, and just using it to its full potential. And we see this in harmonization across the regulatory landscape in the form of PICs. So 62% of these shortages are traced back to quality and manufacturing issues. The spotlight is on quality and manufacturing, right? Vigilant operations management oversight, as we mentioned earlier. It's this key phrase in recent warning letters. It's keeping a careful watch. I pulled this straight off Google, right? Keeping careful watch for possible danger or difficulties. That's exactly in line with where I see the regulators going here. Like, how are you going to keep a watchful eye on possible danger or difficulties with your manufacturing and quality systems? This is this vigilant operations management oversight. And digging down a little bit more into the details within the individual guidance documents, we see this focus on the 3 pillars of governance. Now, remember, this is going to allow us to achieve what we're talking about in step 3, which is the Q10, really like advanced quality, pharmaceutical quality system. We have to, we take all of our processes and we break them up individually on a case-by-case basis. And we look at them with regard to 3 pillars that are going to hold up those processes anytime a regulator comes in the door. The design, right? So do we have that process understanding available? The design, operation, and monitoring. So the data and process map, the risk assessment, the qualification/validation, are those ready for inspection? When it comes to the operation phase, do we have SOPs that are in place but actually fit for intended performance rather than just randomly written, right? Are they based on a focus on design? We can't write an SOP until we have this pillar finished first. Same thing with training. We can't train an operator until first we have process understanding, because we don't know what to include in the training program. And then when we come to monitoring, how do you have external auditing feedback, your own QA internal audit feedback, and then when you see something that appears that needs redesign, like through a CAPA, go back to design first. Can't skip it by going straight to retraining operators on existing SOPs. That may eventually be the CAPA, but your requirement is you first have to evaluate design. If you don't find anything here that needs improvement, then you can go to operation. But you can't, this arrow cannot go from here to here. Nope. No way. Otherwise, you're going to get a citation for inadequate CAPA. You retrained operators, but you see yourself again on that constant hamster wheel that we started with in the opening slide. Q8, Q9, and Q10 really focus us in that area as well. And I'll finish today's webinar before we move to the Q&A with just this one last case study on complaints. So this particular site, since 2022, they've distributed a number of batches to the US market, right? And here are the complaints. And what we see when we look at the trend is that the number of complaints is increasing, right? And that's confirmed later in the observation here. We see the trend in complaints increasing, not in and of itself an observation, but what is the company doing? Are they doing the best they can with the resources they have to understand this trend? Maybe it's just inherent. Maybe it's just due to the number of batches we've been distributing, or something else. But that's what we're talking about with knowledge, intelligence. Without that available, you're not going to be able to make a conclusion, right? If you didn't follow the roadmap, how are you using the data within the complaints system, comparing it to everything else that you know about your process and your product to determine your current state of quality? So in January of 2021, the company performed a risk assessment for the complaints received in 2020, as the patients complained about many issues, including whatever, it's redacted here, but basically the medication stopped working or something like that. And then later in that same month, the site concluded that adequate measures are available and there is no risk to the product quality and patient safety. So the risk assessment said, we've evaluated the data set and there's no risk to patient safety. So we remain in a state of control that is adequate for us with our patients, our products, right? But did they really, in that risk assessment, get to the core question, which is patient safety, product quality? Well, let's see. Was it based on knowledge or was it based on an opinion? See, this is where the rubber meets the road, folks. If it's based on an opinion, no way you're going to get out of that inspection, right? But if it's based on knowledge, now we're talking. Yeah, maybe everything's fine. This increase in trend is not an issue. But that cannot be your opinion. That has to be based on knowledge, objective evaluation. But what they found later on in the 43 is that 94 complaints for this particular issue. Well, let's just say that 91% of the complaints are related to performance of the product. Okay, so even with this increasing number of complaints, the site head stated during the inspection, so this was last month, that the firm has adequate controls in place. There is no risk to product quality and patient safety. And the risk assessment that was done in 2021 is still valid. So that was like 2 years ago. The firm's quality unit failed to implement effective corrective actions to reduce the number of complaints related to the performance of the product. See, here his is excellent, like really forward-thinking 43 here, right? It's guiding the company towards success, which is really the goal of a 43. It's saying take your data that you're gathering in your complaints system, transform that into knowledge by following the roadmap steps that we've been talking about, and then figure out through tools, whether you're dashboarding, whether you're management review, whatever you're doing, how you're going to actually act on that data or not act on that data, right? But the framework has to be there. Otherwise, you're going to have a risk assessment that you're writing based on like siloed data, okay, complaints in and of itself, right? Without a focus on how that data is connected to process understanding, vigilant operations management oversight. There's no way you're going to get there. I can almost guarantee that if this does go to a warning letter, you'll see in that warning letter, vigilant operations management oversight as part of the text. And in response to this letter, please provide. Yeah. So you can see where the regulators are headed in this area. We're talking about a 43 issued from just last month. So transforming data that we have in all of our systems, not just complaints, into knowledge is something we've got to be aiming for, right? As we see it, it is a current expectation. So we take that complaint data set, we put it in context with metadata. So we figure out what metadata is important within that data set. We then transfer that to information via those FAIR principles that we mentioned earlier. And finally, we're going to be able to act on that data through, because now it's actually available as knowledge rather than just data within a complaints electronic system. Yes, excellent. Well, Taylor, I'm like over my time. I know that. So we do have about 15 minutes or so for a Q&A. So maybe we could do that.
Yeah, you're not over your time. You're good. All right, so let me just start by saying I loved your analogies that you used in your presentation. And yeah, and thank you for sharing this knowledge with us. We have quite a few questions, so we won't be getting to all of them in this 15 minutes. So Peter and I will work offline to type up some of these Q&As, and we will share this with you when they're ready. But to start off, how would you overcome process errors, or how to overcome process errors? Yeah,
I think it's a very simple question, yet very complex answer. It's a one-line question, but a very complex answer, like process errors. So again, what we see, I think some companies getting into trouble with regard to this question is like, well, process error is due to like a human error generally, right? And so they're confusing like process error versus human error. It might actually be human error, but when we talk about design, operation, and monitoring, what we have to do first is go back to look at design. Yeah, our CAPA, as I mentioned, may actually be retraining on existing SOPs, but we are required first to look at the process, right? And so when we talk about reducing variability or errors is part of that variability, it really comes back to design. But if we don't have that design like available because we haven't started our governance program yet, we don't have data and process mapping, we don't have a process qualitative risk assessment available, we actually can't do it. So, it comes back to management, providing the sites with the tools that are necessary to actually achieve these goals.
Okay. The next question is based on startups. So do you have any advice or recommendations for implementation from startup companies?
Yeah. With a startup company, I mean, the earlier you start with, especially knowledge management. So you call it quality intelligence is going to come later, right? Because you might not need to act on. You're still gathering data to build your knowledge management program. But if you've got to figure out how to get if you walk into a modern startup and you see data like existing on paper, for example, or existing in silos, oh, I have a bad feeling about the future of that company, when they try to submit the application or when they try to move into commercial manufacturing, because all that data is just existing as such. It's not available to use for future, how we are going to design our facility, how we're going to train our folks on, this particular aspect of loading raw materials. I mean, all that is useless, unfortunately, unless it's integrated into a knowledge management program. Earlier you start, the better. And there are software solutions already out there. I mentioned earlier, like QBD Vision, right? That company here in the US who provides these software platforms to really achieve for startups, but also large companies, like this concept that the regulators are talking about. Yeah.
And
Doesn't
then,
have to be like a homegrown thing is what I'm trying to say.
gotcha.
Yeah.
You mentioned the phrase paper on glass earlier. I think that was my first time actually hearing that. So,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Paper on glass is like, so it's this concept of like, we want to take a paper record and we want to do it electronically. So what we do is we transfer that, we eventually we set up a new software solution and we validate it and we eliminate the paper record. So we've like a form or a logbook or something like e-logs, for example, is paper on glass. We don't want it to just remain as paper on glass, right? What we want to do is okay, great. Like you've reduced some data integrity, like risks for like contemporaneous recording, because you have like e-signatures and audit trails and things like that. But you're only on step 2, like if you take advantage of this, the potentials of paper on glass by focusing on knowledge management, which is like step 4. Now we're talking. Like, don't just stop halfway to your goal, keep going, keep driving forward, But remember, we talked about like, okay, some companies are a little bit scared to do that because of validation. But remember, it just has to be good enough for its intended use. That Part 1110A was written back in 1997, before I was even born. And look how like relevant it still is today, more than 24 years later, 26 years later. Like, amazing how that was written like with such foresight to like to still be totally relevant despite all the advance. We didn't have iPhones or like mobile, really like smartphones back there, but yet that regulation still 100% valid today in 2023. Very cool. Intended performance. Yeah.
All right. Next question. What is the best approach for encouraging teams to share their tacit knowledge? I think
to share their tactic knowledge. Yeah. So that is going to be step 2. That's going to be data governance, right? So this is where we take like, oh, this is how we actually do it. This is a way to capture that, like that information. Actually, it's not knowledge yet, because it's only knowledge in their mind, but that's not within our pharmaceutical quality system. We've got to, don't be scared of this. We encourage this, right? Like we want to encourage this, like get that knowledge that exists here into our quality system. So step 2, which is data governance, says, all right, now we're going to map out the process and we're going to do our qualitative risk assessments. Oh, okay. This is a chance for us to capture all that tacit knowledge and eventually use it Otherwise, it's like just out there, and maybe it gets passed down by word of mouth, or yeah, okay. But what happens if that person leaves, or if they're not there that day? Yeah, step two is a great way of integrating that into the quality system. Yeah,
Okay, I feel like this next question might be on the same lines. So how do you
yeah,
how to improve our system to overcome repetitive human error in the shop floor?
yeah. It's a great question,
Yeah.
right? And when we look at like FDA, EMA, the Chinese authority, PICS, all of the guidance documents that, or MHRA, I apologize if I missed anyone, but all of those guidance documents out there, they all are harmonized with the three pillars we mentioned: design, operation, and monitoring. Um, that really is the solution. I don't think it's that difficult. It's going to take like management resources to get there, right? But it's not a complete rebuild to the way we do things. It's just about taking like the actually you're right. It's a great follow-up to the last question, because it's like taking that what it is now is like knowledge in somebody's head, and
Yeah.
integrating it uh into an actionable format. Yeah. Now, just what is like, we talked about earlier, a barrier between like where we are now and like, as like lack of knowledge, right? Well, this is a different analogy here. Like, what's holding us back from capturing that tacit like knowledge that exists in somebody's head or on the shop floor? Well, it's this idea that we have to be perfect in everything we do, right? And if we flesh those risks out on an actual paper document, for example, like a risk assessment, well, the regulators will just copy and paste that straight into the 43. Wrong, right? That's wrong. What we wanted, because we have to get past this pipe dream of perfection, that somehow all of our documents that a regulator is going to review are going to demonstrate this perfect, ideal manufacturing or laboratory system, or if we're talking about clinical trials, like clinical trial oversight system. No way. It's not even going to be close to perfect, right? But what it is going to be good for its intended use,
Yes.
right? And so just break down that barrier, put pen to paper, or typing, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Get it all, get it in the system, and it will be tough, right? Because this is a different way of doing things. We wanted to have this veneer of perfection anytime a regulator walked in,
Yeah.
but it's not getting us anywhere, right? What we've got to do is just be good.
I got it. All right. The next couple questions are around artificial intelligence. So
Oh, nice.
yeah, the first one we have to start off this section is what kind of AI tools we can use to develop our quality system.
Yeah. So I think the early stages of AI, of like artificial intelligence, remember, we've got to first follow the roadmap, because if you're going to use AI, you're going to have to first demonstrate that whatever's in your knowledge management program is accurate and complete. That's quite difficult, right? That's not as easy as it seems. You have to have a governance plan in place. You have to have Alcoa Plus in place. Those things, right? Okay, so now let's talk about AI. Where we see it going to be, I've seen it three applications, I would say, in the past 6 months, all different. I saw machine learning, which was very cool. So what it was is a machine learning for the separation of components in a drug device combo product. And what it did is it took visual images of the way an operator like unloaded parts onto like a drum, right? And it took that image and it figured out, how could I most efficiently like separate these parts using a robotic arm, right?
Oh,
Yeah, but very cool. So they could take the time it took to separate those components from like 4 seconds to 2 seconds, right? So like half the time. So improving productivity, improving cost savings to the patient, right? Excellent. Now, how do you validate machine learning? Well, okay, the guiding principles now, and I think are going to continue to remain part 1110A, validation for consistent intended performance. We have CSA and other guidances available as well, but that consistent intended performance is really our primary focus here. Well, the intended use is to separate components. Well, what's the risk to patient safety? Negligible, right? So what are the validation efforts? Now I go to Q9 and it tells me, oh, well, the level of effort and formality that you put into this validation effort is going to be commensurate with the risk. Well, what's the risk to patient safety? Negligible. So how much validation work do I have to do? Very little. So I want to get that thing rolling quickly. So that's how we can start to integrate these. More likely than not, it's going to start with some of the like upstream operations like that. And then as we gain experience with, like, for example, machine learning, we will then integrate that into process filling or whatever else, like changing parameters in a tablet press based on what it's learning about the process. But we're not there yet, right? We'll take baby steps. The other applications are like natural language processing. So for example, taking data that exists within our quality system, like complaints or let's say deviations, OSs, whatever, and trying to make connections that we as humans are not otherwise able to do. Like anytime I see the word laboratory in a record, there's going to be like a 80% chance that it's due to a spilling of a sample or something like that. Like starting to make connections within data sets, big data sets, that we are not able to do as humans. So it's enhancing the ability of a human to do an existing job. Cool. Risk, maybe medium in that case. Hence, validation efforts, more medium, things like that. Yeah. Excellent question.
I'm glad you touched on validation because somebody did have a question on that. But next we have, what is needed for sufficient quality oversight and using AI tools in pharma production?
Depends on if we're talking about like a static, algorithm, like for example, natural language processing, that's going to be more of a static algorithm, right? So it's like more of a upfront, like pretty significant validation effort and then periodic oversight, right? But if we're talking about dynamic algorithms, like in the world of machine learning, to be determined. I think that what we're going to see in, so FDA released that AI concept paper in an attempt to gain feedback from industry about how they're going to write the subsequent guidance. So I have to say like TBD at this point, because we don't exactly know. I think I have some ideas about what that's going to look like, but it's probably best with regard to those dynamic algorithms to maybe wait for the further guidance from the regulators. Maybe that's the safe answer.
All right. I think this will be our last question. And like I said, Peter and I will work offline to get to all the ones that we weren't able to answer and then type up some stuff for you. So the last question we have, how would you apply these principles in a completely outsourced model? For example, virtual manufacturer.
Yeah. So what you have to do in those cases, so I always tell companies that are outsourcing, whatever it's outsourcing, whoever you're outsourcing to must have controls in place. So when we talk about step 1, Alcoa Plus, step 2, data governance, step 3, CHQ10, step 4, knowledge management, wherever, all of those steps, like where you are in your like journey, if you're going to outsource to another organization, the baseline expectation is that that organization is equal to or better than your experiences, like where you are within your journey. That should be expected, again, equal to or better than what you're doing. And that has to be reflected in the equality agreement or legal agreement that you're going to sign with the outsourced company, right? Who's responsible for data governance? Who's responsible? And under that is ownership, right? Like who's responsible for data ownership? Who's responsible for knowledge management? Who's responsible for Alcoa Plus, right? All of those things have to be considered. You never want to enter into one of those agreements without evaluating their journey in comparison to yours. Yeah. That can be done through, like, most likely like an on-site visit, but an audit, so to speak, but also maybe like a virtual engagement, perhaps. Who knows how you could do it, but you can't skip that step. You can, I remember learning like early on in my career, like within as an FDA investigator, they would tell us, like, a company, like a sponsor, for example, can never outsource quality. Like, it's the application holder's responsibility. And that simple concept has stayed with me for 15 years, and it still seems appears to be like a very valid statement. Like, you can never outsource quality.
That's a good statement. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that wraps up today's webinar. Peter, I want to thank you for presenting with us. And as a reminder, we will be sharing the recording and slides with you. Peter, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation, Taylor and Redica, and it was a real pleasure. Yeah.
Right.
Looking forward to the future of this QI concept, and who knows what 5 years down the line will look like. I'm excited.
Yeah, agreed. All right, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.